Hello and welcome to Unit 17, Sport Injury, Assignment 3, Part 3. In the previous presentations, we discussed intrinsic risk factors and extrinsic risk factors. We now move on to the preventative measures, both primary and secondary. One of the most important roles of sports injury practitioners is to prevent injuries and thus the physical, mental, social, and even financial harm that goes with them. Primary prevention is preventing injuries in a certain sport or team. So we looked at some of those issues in our previous presentation, and we looked at the potential impact coaches have. Secondary prevention is working with an injured athlete and working out how to reduce further injury or re-injury. Again, we spoke about this in a previous presentation surrounding intrinsic risk factors. Now, both the primary and secondary prevention provide you with a great opportunity for analysis and evaluation, and take the time to prepare that. A key point: any approach to preventing injuries should be well informed, logical, and use a framework. Before we go about putting our preventative measures in, we need to understand that what we are doing is the correct thing at that time. And we can use research to support that. Again, analysis plays a large part of that. So, principles of injury prevention. There are two major sports injury prevention frameworks created by Van Mechelen in 1992 and by Van Tigelen in 2008. The four-step model of injury prevention suggests a cycle of stages going from establishing the problem to ultimately evaluating if the preventative measure has affected the number and type of injuries. This model is going to be a large part of our assignment. It's really important that you use each stage to analyze and finally evaluate. In stage one, we look at to establish the extent of the problem. Is there a large amount of injuries? What are the severity? When is it happening? Is it happening at the end of the season, midway through the season? Are we having a lot of the same injuries occur? And then we move on to our intrinsic and extrinsic factors. At that stage, it's really important for you to analyze 4 intrinsic factors and 4 extrinsic factors and how they could potentially be a problem or a risk for injury. And then we're going to introduce our preventative measures, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about now. So stage 3 is going to be a large part of our assessment and our analysis. And then we move on to our evaluation, the effectiveness of our preventative measures that we put in place in stage 3. And then obviously the process begins again. So this stage is really important. And the 4-stage model of injury prevention suggests that cycle. More recently, Van Tigelen in 2008 suggested an additional process which sports injury practitioners need to take into account before implementing preventative measures. So it's kind of the 2.5 stage, just before that 3 initial preventative measure. And he suggested that we focus on 3 areas. The first being efficacy. Does the research, as we previously said, does the research say it will work? What research is it? Why is it going to work? Why is it not going to work? We wouldn't just put a preventative measure in place without having any evidence of its success. Efficiency. What are the time and resourcing demands? Is it a large impact to the athlete? Is it a large impact to the time of our training? What are the resourcing demands? Is there a financial increment? Is there a human resource issue? In a professional club, we have lots of access to sports coaches, therapists, sports scientists, etc. At amateur level, we might not have that. And then finally, compliance. Are the athletes likely to adhere to what your preventative measure is? If they're not going to follow it, what is the point in starting in the first place? We need to look at all of those factors. As I said, this slide is going to be a major part of your assignment. So we need to move on to who is responsible for the preventative measures. Many preventive measures vary based on the demands of the sport, the level of competition, and the resources available. It also, the contact time coaches and professionals have with individual players plays a role. Many individuals are responsible for injury prevention, including coaches, players, sports injury practitioners, referees, sports scientists, conditioning coaches, etc. And in order to ensure that the preventive measures take place, it needs to be a real team effort. The role of a coach is huge. A coach should have up-to-date qualifications and knowledge of their sport and their athletes. This includes monitoring of loading, for example, physical and cognitive loading, and each athlete's strengths and weaknesses. They should be able to adapt their coaching style, communication style, and expectations to their athlete's ability, age, fitness, gender, etc. For example, they should not coach children as if they are mini adults and should stress the dangers of early specialization in a sport. Particularly in a sport like rugby, tackling is incredibly dangerous. We need to select an appropriate time of when we go in to practicing tackling in order to prevent any injury. You can use that as part of your analysis. The coach also has a role in reinforcing health and safety, making sure athletes wear protective clothing and protective equipment. And it's important that they continue to survey any playing surfaces, ensuring that they are safe to play on. Responsibilities, again, we're looking at equipment and environment. So a thorough risk assessment of training and competition environments must be carried out, as we previously mentioned. And it is important to go through this procedure for the equipment that is used. So are we looking at all our equipment all of the time? New equipment eventually becomes old equipment, and we need to make sure that we are monitoring it. In many sports, protective equipment has changed dramatically as technological advances in materials become more freely available, as well as biomechanical analysis techniques. So how have those types of improvements, those advances in sport, helped us to become safer and reduce the risk? Is there a difference in wearing a baggy rugby shirt in comparison to a new tight-fitting rugby shirt? Is there a difference in the type of the footwear that we're wearing in order to make us, say, more stable throughout a game? And there's also been advances in the protective equipment that we have freely available to all levels of competition. Sports players need to ensure that any sport-specific or specialist protective equipment is used correctly. If it is used incorrectly, it can be a hazard and it can put yourself and others at risk. So when using different types of protective equipment, we should always ensure that the equipment is thoroughly checked prior to use. Always use equipment for the sport which it is designed. You must always use the correct size, not make any modifications to the equipment. Be aware that protective equipment does not make you invincible. For example, scrum hats in rugby do not mean that you can then tackle with your head. And use equipment for both practice and competition. Environmental conditions should also be considered to help reduce injury risk. For example, a training session held on grass might reduce the risk compared to the same training session held on a hard surface. Again, we wouldn't do tackling on a concrete surface in rugby. In weather conditions, if the weather conditions change, perhaps the rain starts to pour down, making the surface slippery, could we move that session indoors? Is the ground too hard to practice tackling? Is the ground suitable to perform any change of direction quickly? We've got performance preparation. So properly preparing the athlete to take part in training and competition will also reduce their risk of injury. An effective warm-up should prepare the athlete to work at game pace. And a good warm-up should follow the RAMP acronym. R, raise the blood flow, breathing rate, and heart rate, raising those areas ready for participation. Activate key muscle groups using dynamic stretches. M, mobilize the major joints. P, potentiate muscles to improve effectiveness through jumping, landing, sprinting, and cutting movements. All of those plyometric activities we've learned about in the past. And obviously, an athlete who's been sitting down or standing still for a period of time, i.e. a substitute, should be encouraged to warm up again. All athletes should take part in a cool down after training or competition. And measures to improve mobility should be taken on most days. These measures only work if they are done on a regular basis. So things like stretching, static and dynamic or PNF, foam rolling, and having regular sports massage. Appropriate training. Athletes should be appropriately trained to meet the demands of their sport and have sufficient recovery time. We need to be aware that rapid increases in frequency, the duration or the intensity or the type of training can have a negative impact on our performances. And it's also incredibly important that we continue to exercise using preventative exercises which develop core stability, proprioception, balance, muscular strength, etc. And you can see an example of a proprioception exercise in our slide. Correction of biomechanical abnormalities. Each player should be screened to identify any potential abnormalities that could lead to injury. We've discussed these again in the intrinsic risk presentation. For example, screening athletes for limitations around their range of motion or any discrepancy in their limb length, potentially issues with their posture or their gait analysis. Once we've been through that assessment, we can then provide support on a one-to-one basis with a conditioning coach, a podiatrist, an osteopath, etc. Remember, there is a difference between professional sport and amateur sport at that level. And then we've also got our final other measures, things like taping and bracing, ensuring diet of all of our athletes with plenty of energy to facilitate adequate recovery or preparation, and then our psychological skills training, our PST, such as that managing those arousal levels, so imagery, progressive muscle relaxation, positive self-talk, etc. Okay, with our assignment, I've given you a breakdown of what we would expect in each of the steps. It is a written document. It should be a formal document. Analysis and evaluation are incredibly important. Make sure you take the time to prepare that. I just want to draw your attention again to you must have a minimum of 4 intrinsic and 4 extrinsic risk factors. And then you can go into analysis during your preventative measures, finally followed by stage 4, your evaluation of how you perceive them to go and whether they were positive or negative.